Welcome to Healthcare IT Today. I'm John Lynn, together with my colleague and friend Colin Hung. The world of technology and healthcare are ever-changing in new and novel ways, and that's why we love this stuff. So join us as we discuss the latest healthcare and health IT news, meshed together in new ways which help generate ideas and new perspectives. Plus, we'll have a little fun along the way. On today's episode, we'll be previewing and making some healthcare workforce predictions and talking about some solutions. And be sure to follow the show on Twitter at the hashtag HITSM and our personal accounts at TechGuy and at Colin_Hung. Plus, check out our 16 years of health IT blog content at healthcareittoday.com. Yeah, workforce is hot right now.
Well, it's a hot button topic. I think for some, it gets people hot under the collar.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, it's hot whether you want to leave. It's hot if you're a boss that has people leaving. If it's hot all around.
Yeah, it's definitely the topic of discussion whenever I talk to anybody. It doesn't matter what role, it doesn't matter what kind of organization. And it's either feast or famine, right? Depending on which side or where you fall.
That's true. There's some people that are thriving, right? If you have a remote workforce, you have opportunities, like it's actually a good thing because you're going to be taking the people from those that aren't as flexible, for example.
Yeah. And, I've heard from a few companies and a few organizations that are actually, not finding it too hard to get people right now because of some of the, cuts that have been made at some of the other tech companies.
Yeah, that's
right?
true.
So there's some people available now that weren't available 6 months ago. So it definitely, is depending on where you are and what department and where physically you're located, you could be either in a very high or very low. Right?
The only people winning are the HR people. Is that?
Although I think they have a lot more gray hair these days too.
That's fair. It's much more stressful. But that's true.
So John, maybe before we dive into some of the technology stuff, let me ask you, what are some effective ways you've seen or experienced personally in terms of keeping people engaged in an organization?
Yeah. So for me, I think it boils down to two values. And, then there's things you do to illustrate this, right? One is, am I valued at an organization? I think that's one. And the second one for me that's important is, do they trust me? And I think it's interesting to think about those two, right? Like, how can the organization show me that I'm valued, right? And, kudos and accolades are nice, right? And that's one form. But I think the way you really show your value is just recognizing the work that they're doing and thanking them and showing gratitude and appreciation. And I think that was, that's one of the ways that I think is key, right? And like, how you do that and that you're intentional about doing that, I think is key. And then the other one is trusting, right? Like, okay, do they trust me to do this? Are they giving me responsibility, right? And I don't think this is true for every position. I think there's some positions where they don't want to be trusted. They just want to be a cog in the wheel and they want to move on with life. But, the high performing players want to be trusted to be able to do these things, right? And to be given responsibility that matters to them. So I'd say those are maybe the two things. And, when I think about the bosses and leaders and organizations I've been in that do that, that's, like, oh, I want to work there.
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly some superficial things that over the last couple decades have been touted as ways to engage people and keep them, like, unlimited vacation, flexible working, where you can work from home, work in the office, all those kinds of things, mentors that you can tap into in the workplace. All these are helpful, but I think, you've hit the nail on the head. Those are superficial. You have to go deeper, right? To really engage and keep people, you have to trust them. You have to listen to them. And by listening to them, I mean, really as a leader, understanding what motivates them and then trying to make sure that their work aligns to what motivates them, right? Like, if you've hired a healthcare marketer, right, who's really into marketing automation right now, unless you sit down with that person and discover, well, actually they want to be a writer, right? you may never have given them that opportunity, and sooner or later that person may leave for that opportunity and you would never know. So to me, one of the most effective ways to keep people is actually sit down and figure out what drives them, and then do everything in your power as a leader to try to engage that, try to point them and help them get to wherever they want to go.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about because it's really about listening and understanding, showing that they care for you. I think that's another one, right? And to me, like all the superficial stuff that you describe, isn't that superficial to individuals, right? So a mom that has kids may value flexibility a lot more than a recent college grad who has unlimited flexibility, right? Like to do whatever, right? Or can show up to the office every day, right? And so, what is superficial to one person may be essential to another. And so, your
True.
point is really a good one as far as listening to understand what does that person need, what are their career goals and ambitions, what wakes them up at night, because of stress or because of excitement, right? And understanding that, I think that's a really good example. Listen.
Yeah, and I think there's obviously some negative stuff as well, right? Like, we've heard horror stories about toxic work environments. And I don't think anybody, no business leader sets out to create a toxic work environment, right? That's just not something people purposely create, but
Yep.
they let it languish, they let it happen, right? And so as one of the most effective ways I've seen, people keep valued employees is addressing and having those tough discussions when you get hints that something is wrong in the workplace. Like when you see two teams starting to fight, you don't let it happen and don't let them just work it out amongst themselves. Like you step in, you figure it out, right? You sit the two individuals that might not be getting along and go, okay, like let's try to get professional here, guys, or gals, and let's work this thing through. Because if you leave it, it just creates
Yeah.
these passive
Festers.
aggressive, right? Like, and that's a big reason why people leave.
Yeah. I think about my very first job out of college. About a week in, the email system was having issues. It was running out of disk space. It was going down. It was all sorts of crazy things were happening. And I got called in the CIO office with my boss, who was in charge of the email system. And the CIO was like, hey, this has to be resolved, and if it's not resolved, then some heads are going to roll, right? Basically, he said it a little kinder, but basically, your jobs are on the line. And my boss, to her credit, was like, hey, that's fair for me, but it's not fair for John. He's been here a week, right? Like, and the CIO said, well, I've said what I've said. And I was like, you what? I just moved my family literally across the ocean to Hawaii, and I'm in the middle of nowhere where there's not a lot of other jobs, right? Like, and you're gonna say my job is on the line. I didn't feel valued at that time, right? Like, I was like, this is not a good environment. Like, and actually, the CIO was gone within 6 months or a year. I can't remember. So, but it was interesting. It was, it was one of those, like, he could have saved me, but anyway, he was trying to get the problem fixed and thought that I don't think my job was really on the line, but he was making it that way because he wanted to achieve his goal. But I just think about even now, what 20 years later, I still feel the emotion of that moment and how I didn't feel very valued right then.
Well, and that's, as a team leader, as someone who's had the fortune of working with some really good teams, people problems are messy. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you're a work environment or a home environment, they're messy, right?
Yeah.
And so a lot of people really want to avoid it, right? They carve it off or compartmentalize and say, well, that's a personality thing, and that's not really not mine and my business to get involved in it.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, that usually backfires. That's probably the worst thing you can do, right?
Right.
You have to
Avoidance is
wait.
bad.
Yeah, you have to wade in, but you don't have to be like heavy-handed about it. You're like,
Sure.
okay, hey, you two have to get along and find a way, right? Like to me, that's like pointless, right? Like it's more of like, how can we find a way? What can we do to make this work? Like, do we have to keep you separated? And in which case, fine, right? Let's, if that's the only answer is to keep these two or keep these two groups separated, okay, let's work this out. Like, if you value both teams, right, and you want to keep them, and you have to kind of start wading into this. So yeah, I've never been a fan of people who just kind of wave their hands and go, you sort it out, right? Like, because to me, what have you done? You've done nothing to solve the problem. You've added nothing, right? Other than give an edict,
Yeah.
which just makes that problem fester.
Absolutely. So, Colin, as you look into the next couple of years, what's your prediction on, are we going to be dealing with this for a long time to come over the next couple of years? Is it going to get worse? Is it going to get better? What's your predictions there?
Yeah, I think for the clinical side, it's going to get worse over the next 2 years. I don't think it's going to get better.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think maybe we might hit a bottom and stay there for a little while. I don't, maybe not, it didn't get worse, but I think it's going to be painful for the next 2 years from the clinical side. The reason why I say that is because, nurses have discovered, for example, that going to an agency and working for these traveling nurse agencies is far better than working for an organization. And these organizations, although they would love to keep these nurses, they cannot pay what these nurses are now being paid. They cannot give them the flexibility where they can take 3 weeks off in the middle of between, engagements. That doesn't happen, right? And
Right.
so until they fix their internal workload and HR and payment, which takes a long time, right? I just think from the nurses' perspective, it's not going to get better. And the same thing with clinicians, like with physicians. I just think, they're getting burned out. That's not going to be something that's going to be instantaneously solved over the next 2 years.
Yeah. The nurse one's a challenging one. It's the travel nurses that I've been hearing stories where like there was one staff nurse and everything else was travel nurse. And I just think about how many patients are going to suffer from the lack of continuity in an organization. I mean, travel nurses are amazing, don't get me wrong, but there's something about the continuity of knowing the organization, knowing the flow, knowing how it's bedded, know how, all of these little cultural nuances that travel nurses don't know. And if you only have one there, like, wow, that's a big change. And we're seeing that happen in a lot of places. And I don't begrudge the nurses. They can get paid sometimes 1.5, 2 times as much traveling. So then, yeah, you can take the 3 weeks break because you just got paid so much and you're getting paid the same and getting nice 3 week breaks. Of course, you got to travel. There's, some can't do that. But anyway, I think it's a challenge. And I think the provider side is going to get dramatically worse. I think the only thing that gives some hope is that when you have an MD degree, there's not as many other jobs that pay as much. So some of that will come back to roost, right? And they'll be like, oh, okay, I just needed a break, and now that I've had a break, I can come back. So that will soften the blow some, right? And maybe it won't lead to the bottom where they're just gone for good, which I think is happening, in other tech industries, right? Where they're like, no, I'm sick of this industry. I'll just go to a new one. We won't see the same exodus in healthcare because the RN and the MD, the DO, it's such a investment of your time and energy that there's not as many options for you to go to. I think on the health IT side, especially for provider organizations, I think it's going to be less of an issue if they accept virtual. Right. So now if you're like, you got to be in the office and all this, like people are going to, call uncle on that and say, no, there's others out there that we can go to. But if you're flexible, I think it's actually going to be less of an issue because of what you said, which is all the other health IT vendors that are venture backed, firing all these people just to, be able to weather this recession, depression, whatever it is that we're going into right now. So that's my prediction is health IT side provider is going to be better because there's going to be lots of talent out there as long as you're flexible about, do they have to be there all the time or just some of the time?
Yeah, I agree. I do think on the tech side, it's a bit more of a rosy picture, rosier anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're definitely going through an inflection point. I think it has been very tough to get talented people to join health IT organizations, whether that's within a provider or an actual company. So I think that's going to get better over the next couple of years as things stabilize. And frankly, as we're starting to hear, people who left companies for the higher pay have realized, oh, maybe I shouldn't have, right? Like it's not all about the pay. It's about some of the other aspects of the job, being in a company that's fulfilling something that's helping humanity, right? Like that's one of the biggest benefits of being in healthcare. So I think we might see a return or an influx of people as people look for that element of these of jobs. So I think in the next couple of years, I think you're right. That will get better for the technology side. And really, I am scared for the provider side of things, because you think about the other thing that's happening at the same time, which is the retirement of a lot of primary care, right? So it's not, yes, we may be minting just as many MDs, but they're all going into specialties. They're all going into, being hospitalists. primary care is getting decimated by a number of docs that are retiring. Like, I was out east recently on vacation, and one of the biggest news stories was the two doctors who run one of the final primary care clinics on the island that I was on. They were going on vacation for 4 weeks, and so there was no coverage. Right? Like,
Wow.
you think about that. There's only 2 primary care docs for the entire population, and it made the local news, right? Like,
Mhm.
and that's because the 10 doctors they used to have, 9 of them had retired. Right.
Yeah,
So
it's tough. And I mean, I heard that recently. I heard someone say, hey, why did you retire? And they said the EHR. They actually said the name of the EHR, but yeah, you're like, oh, okay, well, they were just sick. And I don't think it's the EHR. I think it's the burden that the EHR reflects,
sure,
the documentation, the regulation, everything burden that reflects. And they're just sick of it. They're like, no, retirement
and
sounds good.
the billing and everything. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Hey, if you're just tuning in, you're listening to Healthcare IT Today with John Lynn and Colin Hung. Today, we're talking about the healthcare workforce predictions and solutions. Well, let's get into that solution part, John. So, what are some technology solutions that you've come across or that you've seen that are directly helping with the workforce issues in healthcare?
Yeah. So I would start with, attaching an analytics to your ERP and doing baselines on how much you're paying people. Like, I mean, let's just start there, right? And everyone knows that I like to follow the money, right? But if and then not just the analytics on your ERP solution, but all the data's out there. There's all the benchmarks out there of what your docs are getting paid, what nurses are getting paid, and you got to true up. Let's start there. There's a health equity component there too, right? That I think is worth addressing, and we've talked about in the past. That some people aren't getting paid because of their gender or race, and it doesn't make sense, right? So let's start there. Let's true that up. That would be a big first step. And before you'd be like, okay, well, that's a 10-month project to evaluate salaries and then go research salaries and no, all the data's there. You have the data, you can do this. It takes a couple of weeks, takes some effort, right? But that would be the first project on my list.
No, that's a good one. I really like that. And I think hopefully people are surprised at the results, which means there's an opportunity to improve, right?
Yep.
But even if you didn't and did that analysis and ended up where, hey, we are actually at market, right? And we are paying everyone equity. Well, good news is now you can feel good about yourself, right?
And then you can answer the question when they come in saying, I'm not paid enough. You're like, yeah, you are.
We have the data to prove it. And what a great story to tell, right? Say, hey, we're actually looking at this and we have data to back this up. But what it means is that it does point to other issues, right? And so now you can go focus over there. So yeah, I like that one. I think there's obviously some other technologies that can help with the recruiting side. I think the reality is that you're going to be dealing with traveling nurses. So there are systems and software out there that helps you manage those kinds of vendor relationships, right? And it helps you manage that kind of a workforce. So certainly scheduling software is going to help you weather this storm of the workforce. So, whether that's flexible shifts or matching shifts with skills, I think that's definitely something that people have to look at now. Whereas before you might have a group of nurses, a pool of nurses, and you didn't have to worry as much about like what skill sets they have because you had enough, right, to cover. Now I think you have to be very laser focused and go, okay, like we have this kind of patients in this department. Do we have the nurse that matches those skills and that patient, and can I match them up?
Yeah.
And that way your nurses will be happier, the ones that are still with you, right? And B, you're going to have the skills that are needed in place. So
I think those systems are really interesting, and they've gotten really sophisticated, the best ones, where they'll even offer like a premium on certain shifts they know are hard to fill because they know they're hard to fill and they deserve to be paid more. And so, I think that's interesting. I was surprised as I was thinking about this, though. I haven't heard from these companies. So what's not clear to me, and I'd love to hear from the audience if they're part of this or know firsthand how this is going down. Because my thought would be, oh, these AI driven systems that customize the workforce needs and everything would be great to be able to retain the staff, to reward them for hard shifts and all those things, right? But I haven't heard those stories. So I don't know if they just haven't reached out and it's just, how my sphere of influence and connection has, Or if maybe the other is happening too, right? Where there's not enough people for these systems to work effectively. Like a bid system that pays you more is no good if you don't have any nurses that want to accept the payment that's more. So, like, are they falling apart, right? Where the value add is disappearing because the workforce challenges are so low that we're like, hey, we're going to beg, borrow, and steal whatever nurses we can find. We don't need your AI optimized solution that, that tries to optimize for, an overflow of staffing, right? And so
Right.
I don't know, maybe it fell apart given the staffing crisis.
Yeah, yeah. If you don't have enough people to use that system for, right? Like the bids, like if you only have one person bidding, like what's the point?
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
exactly right. Hey, John, actually, there's a company here in Canada that is doing some work directly here in this space. It's called Time Saved. And what they make is they make a tool for actually the travel nurse agencies to
Oh,
better
okay.
manage their workforce and their pool of nurses. So basically, it is this sort of bid like system where that agency will go, hey, we've got an opening. We're trying to help this customer, this organization fill this kind of a role. Here are the skills that are needed. Here's the certifications needed. Here's the licensure that's needed, and here you go. And then people can bid on it, right?
Hmm.
And say, oh, look, I'm in, and I can be there, and I know this group, or I worked with it, and it actually will do some analysis to say, hey, these are the best candidates that you might want to fill this with. That helps the organization fill these roles much more quickly and fill them with nurses that will actually help that organization, right?
Nice.
Rather than just a body that's just there. They do all this matching, and it happens, in near real time. So they've experienced explosive growth over the last few years,
Makes
and they
sense.
were around even before the pandemic, and now they're just seeing that business take off, and that really helps everybody. And the question that the CEO posed to me was, why don't hospitals adopt this, right, to
Mm.
manage their own workforce? And I was like, that's a great point. It doesn't just have to benefit agencies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, many health systems are kind of their own agency. They're so large, right? Like when you look at it. But I would also shift gears to another one we haven't talked about, which is all the automation solutions out there.
Mm,
Because in many cases, you're not going to find the people that you need to. And if they leave, they might be gone and you may not be able to hire that position again. I think we're seeing that, in the HIM area, the revenue cycle management, some of those maybe lower paid positions that are hard to fill, especially if you live in a more expensive region, right? Where it's hard to get those people to live there on those. And so I think there's some automation solutions, Boston Software Solutions offers some, to really automate many of the solutions where before they might have said, oh, but that's our people. Now they're like, which we've discussed before, oh, please, I need to, because I'm not going to be able to fill that position, right? On the revenue cycle side, we see it with Coro Health, we see it with Notion Health, being able to augment your stuff, whether it's through technology or outside resources or a mix of the two. I think that's the other trend we're seeing in technology solutions that are able to augment what you're doing. I think that's a powerful. Throw in the digital front doors, right? You don't want another phone call to your front desk because you don't have enough people at the front desk to do what you need to do. And there's a lot of automation solutions there, right? Stericycle offers the, virtual check-in, the paperwork done virtually, et cetera, right? Online self-scheduling. There's a bunch of solutions like that are really interesting. And I think that automation is going to be a focus area for many as well.
yeah, I totally agree with you. Like, there's tools out there, like I'm thinking Pegasystems, right? I'm thinking Boston
Yeah,
Software, like
yeah, good
that
one.
do the work, that do the robotic automation. But you talked about it as well. It just, we got to think beyond just the clinical side, right? There's also the administrative side, the call center. That, can you get a chatbot to take off 10% of the phone calls, right? Can you automate some of the answers that you're providing, or route the call to somebody who can deal with it right away better? Like all these kinds of things can directly help the workforce, because you're trying to do more with less, right? And all of
See, and
these
I,
tools can help you with that.
I see that as an indirect benefit as well, because if we automate the stuff that no one wants to do, then they probably enjoy the job a lot more, right? Now, whether that's the front desk or whether it's HIM or whether that's a doctor, right? If we can automate the stuff that they hate, right? If we can automate and make the EHR more usable, that's an indirect benefit to the doctor that makes them want to stick around as well, right? I mean, who wants to work at one where you're like, this process is terrible and they could fix it and they don't? I hear that a lot when they're like, I can't believe I have to do this. And you're like, well, you don't. And they're like, well, they said I have to. And you're like, well, that's not true. They need to just go through the process, change process. So I think that's another example of an indirect benefit.
Yeah, no, I agree with you here. And I think the traveling nurse phenomenon is maybe actually helping with this, because if you bring on nurses who aren't familiar with you and your systems and your processes, well, some of the first things you have to do is teach them, right? And so if you have processes that are broken, that are have loops in them that are unnecessary, you're going to get that pointed out pretty quickly. Right.
Yeah.
And it's going to take you a lot longer to even get these nurses up to speed. So use this opportunity to kind of take a look at your own processes and your own policies to go, hey, why do we ask people to do that? We can just fix that with X or Y and get rid of this step. Do it, right? That'll help make training of these nurses easier right away, but also long term, it'll just remove that frustration that people have with some of the existing. And I don't mean just the EHRs. I mean, like the lab ordering system, like any of these electronic systems. It's not all the EHR's fault.
Sure.
There's a lot of other systems that are pretty annoying to use.
That may be the biggest issue, is the integration between the EHR and all the other systems. I mean, that's what EHR vendors could do, is open up so the integrations are better, right? So that they're easier to do, so that the workflow is easier for everyone involved, patient and provider. You wouldn't think of it as a workforce retention thing, but interoperability can be, because I remember when we implemented the lab interface, and before we were doing like triple work and all this, and the interface, and you're like, oh, so nice. The results are there. The order goes in. Like, it was like this beautiful, like, aha moment. And you could just almost feel like the burden lift off the provider. That was like, oh, it's just there. Yeah, that's great. And oh, I get the result and it notifies me. It was this beautiful, like, magic moment almost, that you're like, oh, that's how it's supposed to work. And that's what technology is supposed to do for me. It's like, it's really beautiful when that happens.
Agreed. And last thing I'll say about this is, one of the biggest process changes that I would suggest is we have to change our attitude to hiring in healthcare right now. Like, it's no longer tell me what you could do for me as the candidate. It's more like, no, let me show you why it's such a great place to be here, why it's so awesome to be part of this organization. You have to do a lot more selling these days. And I know some people will go, well, we shouldn't have to do that. Like, we're this big brand name in the local market. Like, yeah, but you have to, right? Like, because you're competing with all the other hospitals, you're competing with virtual care organizations, you're competing with other technology companies, you're competing with these staffing agencies. You have to sell yourself a little bit more now. So you can't leave it up to a reputation that supposedly you have in the marketplace. You have to really spend that time and dedicate time in that process to sell yourself.
Well, I'd come full circle to where you started, which is listen. If you listen to them, you'll realize it's not more yoga rooms. It's not, it's not the stuff that your wellness program is doing. It's probably little things like optimizing your EHR, or, changing the schedule, or, the small changes like that can make a huge difference, providing flexibility and just understanding what their needs are. People know.
Well, and giving them a voice, right? To your point, John, like making them part of a committee that's actually going to look at this stuff and improve it.
A committee that has teeth.
Exactly. Well, we've covered a lot in this episode, John, and I just want to say thank you to all of you who tuned into this episode of Healthcare IT Today. You can find more details about our show by checking out the programs page on healthcarenowradio.com. And please share your voice and engage with the community at healthcareittoday.com. and on Twitter using the hashtag HITSM. I'm Colin Hung with my friend and health IT collaborator, John Lynn. Thanks for listening, and have a great week.